this was one of the strongest topics I wanted to make sure was covered today, because when we have this military operation, we talk about the battle, we talk about the reconstitution of the 1st Maryland Regiment, goes on to do wonderful things. But people don't ask when they statistically say, and there's X number of prisoners of war, and then we move on, what happened to those guys? So we have got Gabe Neville, who's going to take on this topic. He is a historian whose works focus on Virginia, Pennsylvania, the American frontier, and the origins of the Constitution during the Revolutionary War. He is the author of The Last Men Standing, the 8th Virginia Regiment in the American Revolution, and his research has appeared in the Journal of the American Revolution, American Battlefield Trust, Emerging Revolutionary War, various historical journals. He's also the creator of 2 websites, Revolutionary Virginia at virginia1776.com and the 8th Virginia Regiment at 8thvirginia.com. A former journalist and longtime congressional staffer, he now serves as a senior business consultant at Covington and Burlington LLP in Washington, D.C. So, Mr. Neville.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. The first thing I want to say is that it's an honor to speak with all of you, but it's also an honor to share a stage with some great folks. I want to publicly thank a couple of them. Don Haggist, who's the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, and Glenn Williams, who was a noted historian. Both have been helpful to me personally in my historical research journey, and I want to publicly thank them. They're both superstars. I also want to thank Owen, who has been helpful to me more recently, as in like yesterday. But he was very helpful. So that's me being gracious and humble. Now I'm going to be obnoxious. You'll notice that it says up here, Revolutionary Virginia. So you're probably wondering why it says that here tonight. Well, I just want to all remind you that when Maryland was created, it was carved out of Virginia. And on behalf of the Commonwealth of Virginia, we've been happy for you to use it for a while. When we need the territory back, we'll let you know. All right? So let's get started here. After the battle, things were terrible, right? Long Island, Brooklyn, or Kings County was smashed. Here's a description from maybe the most oft-quoted British officer of the Revolutionary War. I won't read it to you, but just take a glance at that. It talks about putrid bodies lying in the fields around the country, devastation so impossible to express, and so many prisoners that they don't know where to put them. So this is the day after, right? Counts of numbers of American prisoners total vary from 1,200 to 1,500. That's equal to half the population of Kings County, New York, what we now call Brooklyn. And they had to do something with them, and they weren't quite sure what to do. Of that number, I should say, Mordecai Gist, he estimated that 259 Marylanders were killed, wounded, or missing. A maybe more reliable authority, sitting right over here, says it's 256. It's not a big difference, 3. The population of Kings County were largely Dutch, and they were relatively loyal at this point. And the British didn't want to ruin that, so they didn't want to force prisoners into people's private houses. Staten Island was not secure. The rest of Long Island was not secure. And Washington still held Manhattan after the battle, so they didn't really have anywhere to put all these prisoners. Responsibility for figuring out what to do about it fell on the shoulders of a guy named Joshua Loring. Now, every time I say his name, I want you all to say boo, because he was a seriously evil dude. There's no other way to put it. He was the Commissary General for Military Prisoners. He allowed his wife to make very, very good friends with General Howe. Wink, wink, you know what I mean. While he brought in lots of money for what he was doing. He basically withheld funds that were distributed to feed prisoners to enrich himself. The consequence of that, of course, is people starved. So it's his job to figure out what to do. They threw soldiers in barns, Presbyterian churches. Presbyterians were the bad guys from the British standpoint. But they needed a more permanent solution. This is a painting from 1814. These are hulks. A hulk is a ship that it can still float, but is not good for anything else. So they just anchor it permanently, and they use it for various things, but for our purposes, it's a floating prison. This is a row of hulks in Portsmouth Harbor in Britain, actually in 1814. So it was a pretty standard process. They would take these ships, they would remove the masts if they were still any good, remove all the cannons, any equipment that was any good, and they would just throw prisoners on the ships. There was literally a Hulks Act. In 1776, Parliament officially authorized the use of hulks for housing prisoners. This would be criminals back home, that's what these ships presumably are, but also here in the war. The most famous, or I should say notorious, of all of the prison hulks was HMS Jersey. That is HMS Woolwich, or we Americans would say Woolwich. It's the same class of ship, it's a fourth class ship of the line. The Jersey was built in 1736. It fought in the War of Jenkins' Ear. You all are all very familiar with that war, I know. The 7 Years' War, by the time of the Revolution, had been converted into a hospital ship. None of our guys were on it, because it wasn't turned into a prison ship until 1779. But it is by far the most notorious of the ships, so I thought I'd mention it. And I'll show you a representation of that ship as a hulk later on. So after the battle, soldiers were, as I said, thrown into barns and Presbyterian meeting houses, but then they were moved onto ships, primarily in Gravesend Bay. Americans taken as prisoners at this time were not regarded as prisoners of war. They weren't even really regarded as criminals. They were worse than that. They were traitors. Does anybody know what the penalty for treason was in Britain? Death, but worse than that. It was hanged, drawn, and quartered. It is basically tortured to death. You are hanged, but not until you're dead. Then they take you down, right? Then they cut you open. They make you watch your entrails get burned in front of you. They cut your limbs off, they cut your head off, and then they put your head on a pike. That's the penalty for treason. Now, by this time in history, they weren't literally doing that most of the time. But that's what they did to traitors. And the rebels were traitors. Many of the prisoners, the American prisoners, will say that they were constantly being badgered by soldiers, jail keepers who said, you know, you're going to get hanged. We're going to take you, we're going to hang you. This William Slade from a Connecticut soldier says, we was called Yankee rebels going to the gallows. It's typical. By the way, they were finally treated as enemy combatants in 1782. At that time, fairly recent example of what was done to rebels and traitors is this. This is after the Battle of Culloden, the Jacobite uprising, the 45 in Scotland. This is what happened to captains after the Battle of Culloden. Then the British took Manhattan on the 15th of September. They took the ships up there opposite in the Hudson River, what then is called the North River, opposite King's College, which you see up the top left. Enlisted men were put ashore on the 5th of October, and officers were put ashore on the 7th. The enlisted guys were put initially in the Old North Dutch Church and in a couple of sugar houses. So these are sugar refineries. They are big stone, strong warehouses, factories. Officers were mostly taken to near King's College. There it says Liberty House. It's an ironic name. It was called that because it had previously been the headquarters for the Sons of Liberty. and what was called the Provost Marshal's Jail, or just the Provost Jail. I told you to boo every time I said Joshua Loring. I also want you to boo anytime I say William Cunningham. He was the Provost Marshal, and he was known for exceptional cruelty. At night, he would tell the prisoners that they needed to get in their kennels, as if they were dogs. He routinely threatened prisoners with being hanged, as I said. He denied them provisions. Supplementary food was sometimes brought to the prisons by nice people, people who took pity on them, usually poor people. Even prostitutes would bring them food. And he would walk up and down the halls and kick the food over and make the soldiers lick it off the floor. That's William Cunningham. Excellent. Well done. Here's a couple of pictures just for illustration. On the left is the old North Dutch church that was converted into a prison. Planks were laid across the second floor gallery so that they could lay prisoners. It could be a two-story building. The sugar house on the right was actually not used as a prison. It's just the last one that survived in New York, so I can show you a photograph instead of an illustration. Housing prisoners on ships was controversial, and it was practiced in Britain. Fairly early in the war, an American privateer was captured somewhere near Britain, and it was taken into the Thames River, and the traders on board were housed in it. And this anonymous petition, I think to the mayor of London, was published in the paper, protesting the treatment. And this is worth reading. It says that they are inhumanely closed down like wild beasts in a small, stinking apartment in the hold of the sloop, without a breath of air in this sultry season, but what they receive through a small grating over the head, the openings in which are not more than 2 inches square. The putrid strains issuing from the hole are so hot and offensive that one cannot, without the utmost danger, breathe over it. The miserable wretches below look like persons in a hot bath, panting, sweating, and fainting for want of air. So that's life on a prison ship. This was probably written by William Lee, one of the Lee brothers, and one of 2 Lee brothers that was in London as a diplomat at the time. This is a Indian ink wash sketch of men by John Trumbull. It's in the collection of Fordham University. It was long believed to be a representation of men on the Jersey. Fordham is, I don't think, ever described as anything other than soldiers on a prison ship, and it has been more recently suggested that it might actually be men inside of a mental institution. That's one of the actual sugar houses. That's Van Cortland's sugar house, one of 2 men were put into, along with others. And William Darlington, who I couldn't find a unit he belonged to, but that's a Pennsylvania name I happen to know. He said they started to die like rotten sheep in there, and the enemy seemed to take a kind of infernal pleasure in their suffering. And Lieutenant Jabez Fitch from Connecticut says that the prisoners in general grow remarkably sick and die very fast. Prisoners of war, so let's just pretend for a moment that these were French prisoners, in other words, not rebels and traitors. They were supposed to get 2/3 of a British soldier's rations. By one calculation, that would add up to 1,640 calories a day. It's not what's recommended for us to eat. It's not really enough to maintain your weight or your health, but it's something. British soldiers could supplement their own diets by stealing or buying food or catching chickens. The American prisoners didn't even get to 2/3. One officer said that in the morning he would get a saucer of chocolate, or just hot chocolate. Sounds good, but it's not much of a breakfast. He would get flour pudding for lunch. Doesn't sound great. And a mixture of peas and butter and rice for dinner. So not enough to live on. Let's pause just for a second. I want to remind you of who we're talking about when we're talking about the Maryland Battalion. The Maryland Battalion was raised as part of the state's second force authorization. The first force authorization was just Minutemen. On January 1st, the Maryland Convention decided, okay, of 76, okay, we need to have like full-time soldiers. So they authorized the Maryland Battalion, which was going to be composed of 8 musket companies and 1 rifle company, which would be raised in the West. Rifles were a frontier weapon, so Frederick County. Unlike Virginia, everybody was raised at large. So these soldiers, regardless of what company they're in, they could come from anywhere in Maryland. But typically they would come from the neighborhood where their captain and the lieutenant and other company officers were from, because they were the ones doing the enlisting. 9 companies adds up to 676 men, including officers. There are also 10 independent companies, 7 of infantry, and those are the relevant ones for us today because we're going to talk about those more. But there are also 2 artillery companies authorized and 1 company of Marines, and that adds up to 1,060 with officers. Interestingly, just like Virginia, the convention said what the uniform was, and it was a hunting shirt. There are a couple of people who's wearing a hunting shirt here today. I saw a couple of people. There's a guy back there like, would you stand up in your hunting shirt, please? That is the uniform of the Maryland Battalion of the independent companies. Thank you, sir. It also said that they were all to be different colors to identify what company you're in. And the Marines, theirs were to be blue. Everybody else got to pick whatever color they wanted. So the Maryland Battalion, they are not Continental soldiers. They are Maryland soldiers. Glenn made this point earlier today as well. They've been raised by Maryland for Maryland. Now, unlike Virginia, where their provincial soldiers were to protect Virginia and only Virginia, Maryland actually said in the ordinance that they could go to Maryland, of course, Delaware, Pennsylvania, or Virginia. So neighboring states. Didn't say New York. And those are the companies. My understanding from something that Owen wrote is that there were also 3 independent companies that made it to New York. His smallest total force was a little bit larger than this 676 men that belonged to the provincial battalion proper. Okay, also with Owen's help, I'm going to talk about 7 soldiers who left some sort of an account, either directly or from other sources, of their time in captivity. And this is a list that shows you what company they belong to and their likely home county. I think in each case that's actually the home county of their captain. So we'll start with Jacob Harmon. He was in what was originally George Stricker's rifle company from Frederick County. Stricker was transferred to another regiment, and Benjamin Ford became the captain by the time of the battle. Most of the rifle company was killed or captured. Let me pause just for a second and talk about rifles. The best use of muskets and rifles is what Daniel Morgan did in the Saratoga campaign, where you've got rifles shooting at a distance and muskets protecting the rifle because they've got bayonets, so bad guys can't come too close. Something like that may have happened in Brooklyn. If they were effectively doing what combined arms tactics, right, where the bayonets are keeping the bad guys at a distance and the rifles are shooting at a distance, that could explain why they were so effective that day. I don't know if they were trained for that, and nobody, as far as I can tell, nobody really figured that out until Daniel Morgan and Henry Dearborn figured it out. Something to think about. Harmon was captured. He was taken to Halifax, Nova Scotia, along with a bunch of others, evidently. He was then conscripted into the Royal Highland Emigrants Regiment. He escaped on May 1st, 1778, possibly back in New York as a British soldier. And he was debriefed by Alexander Hamilton. It's not clear what happened to him after that. Hamilton simply referred to him as a British deserter. And there's no clear record of what happened to Harmon. after that. So here's another guy, Peter McNaughton, also in the rifle company, also conscripted, and he escaped. He escaped 6 months after Harmon escaped. And we don't know anything about what he did between his capture and that time. But it stands to reason that he also went to Halifax, also joined the Royal Highland Emigrants, but we don't know that, and just escaped later than Harmon did. When he did escape, he was debriefed by General Charles Scott, who was in charge of intelligence at the time. Scott believed his story and sent him back to the Maryland line. He re-enlisted and served at the end of the war. Pretty cool. John McLean, he was a private in Peter Adams' company, probably from Harford County. He was briefly held in a prison ship and then conscripted into the Queen's American Rangers. So that's a loyalist unit that was raised by Robert Rogers. Who watched Turn? So you remember the bad guy with the bonnet? Right. That's him. That's Robert Rogers. So he was conscripted into the Queen's American Rangers as it was being formed, by the way. So he was possibly at the skirmish at Mamaroneck, New York, possibly at the Battle of White Plains, possibly at Fort Washington as a British soldier. He escaped on November 16th in that no man's land between the British and the Americans in New York, sort of near the Connecticut line, and was interviewed by New York Militia General George Clinton, who returned him to service, and he may have been at the Battle of Trenton. Sergeant Thomas McKeel, who we've heard about a little bit already today, also in Peter Adams' company, but probably from Caroline County. He said that he remained a prisoner on board a prison ship until the British troops got possession of New York, so that's September 15th. He was taken ashore and imprisoned in New York with the Maryland officers and prisoners, so probably in a sugar house or that church, until he was paroled, which happened in the month of February 1777. So most of the captives actually were paroled eventually. And many of you know what paroled means, but it is you are released either on a limited parole, which means like officers would often get a limited parole. In fact, these prisoners got limited paroles. They're allowed to move around New York, but they're not allowed to leave. And it's a question of honor. And as far as I can tell, people really adhered to it generally. All right, now here's an interesting one. So this is an officer, First Lieutenant Samuel Sterrett. He, right after the battle, General Howe told him that he could have a parole. But Joshua Loring, thank you, he said he would not release him unless he first accepted the king's amnesty. In other words, swore an oath of loyalty to the king. And he wouldn't do it. According to Lieutenant Sterrett. I'm not sure he's telling the truth. According to Sterrett's account, Loring repeatedly pressured him to take the loyalty oath. He repeatedly said he would not, and he kept pressing for the parole that he had been promised by Howe. And then one day, according to Sterrett, Loring just simply announced that Sterrett wasn't even on his list of prisoners. Well, that must mean he took the oath, right? So Sterrett says that he's basically being framed for being a loyalist or being a traitor or a turncoat, but he denied it vehemently. But nonetheless, he's not on the list of prisoners, so he's free to go. So he left, and he returned home, and you can imagine that when word got out, he had some explaining to do, and we have a letter in which he is explaining himself. Okay, I kind of saved the best for last. So this is the McMillan brothers. Owen showed us a little bit about them already. So they were also taken to Halifax, but did not enter British service, which raises some interesting questions, right? The other guys were evidently conscripted into British service, but these guys went up there and did not enter British service. So, this could be a little bit messy. Maybe the guys who did enter British service just got tired of freezing to death and just did it. Maybe they did it thinking, well, if I join, then I can escape later. And the accounts we have, they did. So it could be a little bit complicated. But Macmillan brothers were taken to Nova Scotia and refused to enter British service. And then they escaped in a group of 10 men and spent 10 weeks traveling in the wilderness. They started in Halifax, they had to cross the Shubenacadie River, and then curve around the Bay of Fundy, cross the St. Johns River, cross what we now call the St. Croix River, to Machias in Maine, where now they're in friendly territory, and a American militia colonel got them a ride on a boat to Portland, Maine. Samuel Macmillan was sick at this point and stayed there to recover, but his brother continued on. As they were traveling, they lived on seaweed and shellfish and snails. I looked up the seaweed, and it's now regarded as a superfood. You can buy it in health food stores. So they were doing okay. One of the men spoke French, so they had one or more encounters with Indians who might have captured them, enslaved them, scalped them, whatever would have happened to them. But because they spoke French, they could wheedle their way through the circumstance. They both eventually got to Boston, re-entered service in the Massachusetts line, and fought at the Battle of Monmouth. Pretty impressive. Okay, just about done. I talked about the fate of individual soldiers a little bit. Before I wrap up, I want to talk about what happened to the Maryland Battalion. You'll remember that I said that they were not Continental soldiers. They were provincial soldiers. That changed. So on August 17th, 76, that's literally 10 days before the Battle of Brooklyn. Congress resolved that it be recommended to the Convention of Maryland that they raise and arm two battalions upon the Continental establishment. That the men for the said battalions be enlisted to serve during the war. That's very unusual. Usually, it's a one-year enlistment. Remember that Americans and the Brits, they didn't like standing armies. Like professional long-term soldiers, particularly here, was not something that we liked. But here it says enlisted for the war unless discharged by Congress. So 2 battalions. 2 months later, the Maryland Convention resolves that 4 commissioners be appointed to go up to New Jersey and New York, talk to the soldiers who were up there. So the Maryland Battalion, the independent companies, and the Maryland Flying Camp, which Glenn talked about earlier. Make lists of everybody who's in service, and then those who are willing to engage in continental service should be enlisted or given new commissions. So they're presently in the Maryland provincial line. They have promised to serve Maryland. They have not promised to be continental soldiers or to serve Congress. So they have to make a new commitment, and it's not guaranteed that they will. So these commissioners go up there and talk to the soldiers and try to get them to do it. And the plan is to simply convert the Maryland Battalion into a continental regiment. So that would be the 1st Maryland. And then take those independent companies and turn them into a 2nd new regiment. And it says here at the bottom, just to emphasize that this is voluntary, that they should exert their utmost endeavors to procure the enlistment of the regular troops. They're not just trying to re-enlist the Smallwoods men. They're trying to re-enlist Smallwoods men, the 7 independent companies, and the Maryland Flying Camp. I don't know how many soldiers that is. They're basically militia who have been sent up. Their enlistments, if I remember correctly, expired December 1st, the Flying Camp. This is HMS Jersey as a hulk. 1779. There are no actual from-life pictures of it, but it was so notorious that after the war, many people tried to create representations of it. It just sat there in Wallabout Bay, rotting, and the men on it rotting as well. Prisoner treatment was bad throughout the war. for men in British hands. So this is Lafayette writing in 1779, talking perhaps about some of the men we've been talking about, but I think primarily about men who were captured at Germantown in 1777. He says the prisoners were crowded together in a ship in New York where they had to breathe foul air and suffer from everything that the grossest insolence could add to starvation, filth, disease, and complete neglect. There was an exchange of prisoners negotiated in 1778, and he says 500 Americans, half dead, had been brought ashore. Most of them died there, and General Washington quite naturally refused to count them in the exchange. Pretty awful. And then down south, I won't read this because my time's up, but after the surrender of Charleston, after the siege in 1780, there was again an exchange in 1781, and it became quickly apparent that enlisted men who had been promised full rations and to live on land had been put on prison ships, beaten mercilessly unless they agreed to enlist in the British service. Many of them did it thinking that they could then escape, but they were taken to Jamaica. That's a representation of American officers complaining to Lafayette in Virginia, asking that he figure out a way to retaliate. John Adams corresponded with his wife on this subject 3 or 4 years before, and she had said, okay, they're abusing our prisoners. Let's be the good guys and be nice to our prisoners. And then everybody will know that we're the good guys. And John writes back and says, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but retaliation must be a practice in some instances in order to make our barbarous foes respect to some degree the rights of humanity. They have to fear us, or they're going to keep doing what they're doing. This is what was originally Livingston's sugar house. This is the most notorious of the sugar houses. I have read that for decades after the war, veterans would travel to New York with their kids and point it out and say, I lived in there for 3 years and I'm one of the few who survived. It was eventually, of course, torn down. That's the last of the sugar houses. There's some debate about whether it was used at all. This is a memorial in Green Park in Brooklyn. It's called the Prison Ship Martyrs Memorial. There's no sugar house prisoners memorial, not really. But that last sugar house I showed you, when it was torn down, people recognized how important it was. And they saved a couple of the windows.
Yes.
And one of them is in Van Cortlandt Park, way up in the Bronx, as a memorial. And the other one is embedded in the wall of an outbuilding at New York Police Headquarters.
One police plaza.
There you go, yeah. This is what I do. Revolutionary Virginia is my primary website now. I published a book on the 8th Virginia, so that website, I don't add to it much anymore. It's mostly a reference tool now. But the website I use now is virginia1776.com. I have a Facebook feed. Almost every day some little interesting tidbit goes out to it. So if you're a Facebook user, you might want to follow me. And if I get a decent recording of this, I'll have a YouTube version of this with the slides up in a few days. And this is my book. If you're interested in Virginia, it's, I think, unique. Regimental histories from the Revolution are very hard to do because there's just less to work with than there is for, say, the Civil War. I spent literally 20 years researching this. It was a hobby that turned into an obsession and then a book. I start when they're kids during the French and Indian War, and I follow them through the war. I explain in some detail how the companies formed and how they entered service. I follow them through the war, and then after the war, as pioneers out west, living in their log houses in Kentucky. It's really rare to find a book. I'm bragging, I'm sorry, but it's really rare to find a book from this period that's sort of about the regular guys and their experience in the war. Most Revolutionary War books are about a battle or a general or a senior officer. This is a little bit different, so I hope you'll be interested. And I'm done. Thank you all very much.
Again, we'll take one question, and we'll, after Dr. Shadow's presentation, we'll have the round table.
Yes, sir.
Can you
Joshua Loring and William Cunningham.
Boo.
Thank you. I think they had your attitude. But then it kind of, you saw the John Adams quote? I think the deal was, well, if we do that to them, then they'll do it to us. We had their prisoners too. So.
I guess I have a question. How much is it, at the beginning, there were only American prisoners, and then as the war progresses, there's British prisoners, and then there's some type of, you treat our guys bad, and we'll treat your guys bad?
So-
Is that what happened?
You said we were out of time now. There were British prisoners first. There was a ship of, I think, Highlanders that were captured in Virginia in 1775 early. And they were brought on land, and the plan was they were going to break them up into small groups and send them to farms to live with families in 5 or 6 designated counties. And the plan, a little bit like Abigail was advocating, was we're just going to love them to death, right? They're going to learn how great it is in America, and they just and they'll become our friends, and hey, that might even become American soldiers, right? They didn't stick with that very long, but that was the original plan in Virginia. It's kind of sweet, right? A little naive.
I'm just going to do a follow-up. Thank you for using that picture. Viva Lafayette.